Jordan Kelman, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts here at UL Lafayette. It's very, very exciting to see people here from many, many different walks of life in Lafayette, in Acadiana, and beyond. And that's exactly what we had in mind for this colloquium. This emerged out of a conversation, seemingly innocent conversation, in our office, in the Dean's office at UL, where Mag Ritchie from the Friends of the Humanities and Sally Donlin and I from our office were talking about how our habits of civic participation and engagement and communication and contemplation have changed over time, and how we all perceived that there was a desperate and growing need for forums for asking big and deep questions about what the nature of civil society is and what the nature of civic society can be, and what our part can be in reinventing it. So we lamented for a few minutes and wrung our hands, and then all sort of looked at each other and decided, well, if nobody else is going to do it here, probably we need to do it. So we agreed at that moment to launch this particular colloquium planning and to make it the beginning of a longer series where we would contemplate these themes. And with the incredibly generous support of the rest of the Friends of the Humanities organization, of the rest of the College of Liberal Arts, and especially the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities, I'm delighted to see that our idea is now a reality. So you may have noticed on your way in, there is a fabulous display of student artwork on this theme in the lobby, just on your way into this theater, that consists of sculptures that were created by architecture students who were given lines of poetry from Octavio Paz and Maria Rilke to contemplate, and the theme of our colloquium tonight, reimagining civil society, and asked to create a sculpture within a wooden box to represent that. And what they came up with is quite striking and quite amazing, and I invite you to check it out on your way out. But the main attraction this evening is the colloquium, which is about to start. And here to moderate that colloquium is Elsa Dimitriadis. Elsa?
Thank you, Dean Kelman. Today's format consists of 4 brief lectures by well-known scholars in the area of literature, history, women's studies, and architecture design, followed by a conversational question and answer session with them and you. Japanese philosopher and community activist Daisaku Ikeda said, "Everything begins with dialogue. Dialogue is the initial step in the creation of value. Dialogue is the starting point and unifying force in all human relationships." As we've moved farther and farther away from the principles of civil discourse for a variety of reasons, which we could and should continue to investigate and consider, our ability to appreciate the perspectives of others has diminished. Our ability to listen to one another and think to ourselves, I'm listening to a fellow human being, one who shared the same air, the same planet, and the same time on this earth, and simply for that, I can take a moment and consider their perspective and experience, is vanishing. Today we gather here at Light to actively engage in civil discourse, to listen and, as John Locke described, let our minds rest upon and be satisfied within its search after true knowledge. It must be the journey of conversation and not merely the destination that satisfies us. And in order for that search for true knowledge to occur, we must be active participants. We must ask questions without being sure that we already know the answers, and engage in a true, common conversation, one amongst another. Our presenters today are Dr. Carl Richard, a professor of history at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. He's the author of 8 books, including several on ancient Greece and Rome, and several on the American founders. Dr. Maria Sager is an assistant professor of English at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, where she studies 19th century American literature and critical race and ethnic studies. Dr. Janet Alured is a professor of history and women's studies at McNeese State University, where she teaches women's studies and courses on the history of the New South, Louisiana, American women, and 20th century United States. Our final presenter will be Professor Corey Saft. Corey Saft is an endowed professor at UL and the undergraduate coordinator in the School of Architecture and Design. Corey maintains his own design and research practice, focusing on high-performance design, and is also the director of the university's Sustainable Development Lab, a research and practice laboratory focusing on housing, civic space, and cultural resource development. As you've heard, we have 4 outstanding guests today. As they will be presented back to back, I invite you to jot down any thoughts or questions you have so that we can have as robust a conversation afterward as possible. Before we get started, a reminder to please take a moment and silence all cell phones and electronic devices. Thank you. Let's please give a warm welcome to our first presenter, Dr. Carl Richard.
Thank you. I was asked to provide some historical perspective, and I did so according to my own research interests, which is sort of comparing ancient and modern republics is where I come at it from. As the citizens of small participatory republics, the ancient Greeks and Romans made no distinction between the people and the government. You know, for instance, in a society like Athens, where the people made the laws themselves, and it was a small society, it made no sense to make a distinction the way we do between the people and the government. Thus, they saw little need for civil society as we think of it, private groups, private individuals trying to accomplish public purposes. They believed it was the duty of the polis not only to protect citizens from domestic criminals and foreign invaders, but also to help them develop their intellectual and moral faculties. For this reason, the government of Athens, which is the first major democracy in history, funded the temples and statues of the Acropolis and the first plays in Western history. Paradoxically, these plays included not only the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, but also, I think this is crucial, the comedies of Aristophanes, which frequently lampooned the city's leaders. And the comedian did so not in a time of peace, but at the height of Athens' most destructive war, its fight to the death against its dreaded enemy Sparta, a war that his comedies also strongly criticized. Thus, one valuable trait that the polis inculcated was that of self-criticism. In the Politics, Aristotle summarized the Greek conception of government. If earthly happiness depended on virtue, and if virtue depended on rational training and habit, as Aristotle contended, it followed that the proper role of both the polis and the friend must be to help the individual in his quest to become virtuous. Reflecting centuries of Greek tradition, Aristotle wrote, "Legislators make the citizens good by forming habits in them, and it is in this that a good constitution differs from a bad one." Since the attainment of virtue was as difficult as it was essential, it could be achieved only through mutual aid. The polis in which one lived and the company that one kept within it were crucial to one's chances of becoming virtuous and thus happy. This logic explains why ancient political theorists focused so much attention on prohibiting immoral behavior. Immorality was like a cancer that would grow until it corrupted all of society, thereby making it almost impossible for the individual to lead a moral life. It was absurd to pretend that individual immorality had no effect on social virtue, or vice versa. No man was an island. Aristotle claimed man is a social animal and one whose nature is to live with others. Society preceded the individual, not only historically, but in order of importance. The polis was a body, each individual a limb. And same thing with friends. Virtuous friends were the greatest of external goods, according to Aristotle, because they help one achieve virtue. Aristotle wrote, "If a friend becomes wicked, It is necessary to lead him back into goodness, for it is a better and more loving act to aid him in acquiring character than to aid him in acquiring wealth. Friends were bound to each other by the closest ties. When asked, "What is a friend?" Aristotle replied, "One soul dwelling in two bodies." In this sense, he envisioned the polis as a collection of friends or an extended family. As founders of the first totalitarian society in history, the Spartans possessed an even more robust conception of the role of government. Boys were separated from their parents at age 7 and sent to boarding schools where they were trained to fight and little else. As young men, they then joined military brotherhoods and lived in the barracks even after marriage until late in life. The historian Plutarch, though an admirer of the Spartans, compared them to bees, beings incapable of leading private lives. While the Romans did not go to such extremes, they too exalted loyalty to the society above all other values. We see this in their foundational myths. At the command of the gods, Aeneas abandons personal happiness with the Queen of Carthage for wars with Latin tribes that he would rather not fight, so that his descendants can go on to establish the city of Rome. Horatius sacrifices his life, destroying the bridge behind him to save Rome. Cincinnatus relinquishes dictatorial power for the sake of the city. And the one that strikes me the most manliest even executes his own son for disobeying military orders, saying, "You have subverted military discipline on which the fortune of Rome has rested up to this day. It is a harsh example we shall set, but a salutary one for the young men of the future." You know, today parents can get in trouble for spanking their kids. He executed his, and the Romans said, "That's our kind of guy." The message in ancient societies perpetually engaged in wars for survival was always the same: the needs of the society outweigh those of the individual. By contrast, modern political theorists, including Republicans like John Locke, whose lead the American founding fathers followed in this respect, define liberty not in positive terms, the way the Greeks did and the Romans did, as the freedom to achieve one's potential with the government's assistance, but in negative terms, as freedom from government intrusion into one's private life. Thus, the founders drafted a constitution that strictly limited the power of government. This emphasis on a strict limitation of the government's role in society necessitated a substitute to provide the social goods previously furnished by government. Thus was born civil society, an effort by private organizations and individuals to provide social enrichment or to spearhead social reform. By the time Alexis de Tocqueville visited the United States in the 1830s, he was so struck by the proliferation of such organizations that he declared, "Americans are society mad." These antebellum organizations sought to expand public education, to limit the sale and use of alcohol, to aid the poor, to reform the prison system, to construct asylums for the mentally ill, to enfranchise women, and to abolish slavery. Most Americans today possess a combination of the ancients' positive view of liberty and Locke's negative view of it. Thus, while our governments now fund public education and the arts, we still rely on private philanthropists and organizations to meet various social needs. The correct balance between these two methods of meeting social needs will probably always be a matter of dispute, reflecting different values and conceptions of human nature. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, great. So I first want to thank the Friends of the Humanities, the College of the Liberal Arts, and the College of the Arts for putting this event together and for inviting me to be here with you today. It's really a pleasure to be a part of this discussion. As the organizing focus of this public forum acknowledges, we're living in an era in which having conversations about solving important problems has become increasingly difficult. sometimes it seems that we can't even agree that there is indeed a problem to be solved. I experience this daily in the classroom. As a professor of literature, I regularly assign texts that compel my students to engage with perspectives that are different from their own. Doing so has allowed me to pinpoint what I believe to be one of the primary obstacles to having productive conversations about how to address significant issues. And that is our tendency to focus on the individual rather than the structural. And by using the word structural, I mean to indicate structures of power. This is especially easy to do when studying literature. After all, most pieces of fiction tend to feature a handful of characters who are meant to follow closely and with whom we may potentially empathize. Students often extrapolate this spotlight on the individual to consider how they themselves exist in the world. Narratives of individual experience, we know, are really, really powerful, especially in the United States, where individualism tends to be privileged over and above collectivity. This ethos is captured in the platitude we hear repeatedly: here you can be anything you want to be if you work hard enough. However, we also know that narratives of individual experience don't always offer a compelling picture of the whole, especially of how power is distributed in our society. In fact, individual narratives, and by extension, pieces of anecdotal evidence, sometimes reinforce conclusions that dispute more complete assessments, that attempt to understand the larger structures of power embodied in our systems, institutions, and ideologies. When we move beyond thinking about our own individual experience, or even another person's individual experience, we can start to see patterns that reveal that power is unevenly concentrated and reproduced. This naturally leads us to ask how and why that is the case, and voila, we've shifted from an individual narrative to a structural one. This afternoon, I want to suggest that attending to the structural can transform civil society into a site for problem solving. But first, we must understand what civil society itself is. The Oxford English Dictionary defines civil society as that aspect of society concerned with and operating for the collective good, independent of state control or commercial influence. As the definition indicates, civil society is about more than the individual. It's fundamentally concerned with the collective. A focus on the structural allows us to concentrate less on our own experience of something and more on understanding experiences across broad swaths of the population. Doing so allows us to recognize the existence of issues that don't directly affect us, and potentially helps us to build solidarity with the people whom those issues do affect. One of the problems with attending to structural power, though, is that once you begin to see how it operates, it's difficult to imagine any aspect of society that exists untouched by state control or commercial influence. We're all immersed in a society pervaded by fundamental ideologies that in many ways extend the control of the government and the economy. We tend not to think of these ideologies as ideologies, but rather as common sense. Most of us uncritically and passively accept them and even perpetuate them on a daily basis. For example, consider the entrenchment of the idea of the American dream, expressed in the platitude I mentioned earlier. Here you can be anything you want to be, if you work hard enough. This belief reflects several intertwined ideologies: democracy, freedom, capitalism, and individualism, just to name a few. It makes a structural claim: no power structure will hold you back, that simultaneously places responsibility on the individual. So if you don't succeed, it's your fault. We can all think of someone we know, an anecdotal individual narrative, that confirms the so-called truth of this claim. But if we're looking at it structurally, we can see the potentially insidious nature of accepting such a claim at face value. It suggests that collectivity isn't necessary, and that structures of power are benevolent and non-restrictive. It implies that we need not necessarily reimagine civil society. I want to focus on one of the most pressing issues that we're struggling to address in civil society today, and that is racial justice. In some ways, this issue may seem to have recently reemerged because we lived for a time in an age of colorblindness, marked by such false statements as "I don't see race," and by explicitly race-neutral policies on the books that were nonetheless disproportionately racialized in practice. This period was, in many ways, a legacy of the multiculturalism of the civil rights movement. However, we've recently moved into what feels like a new era of more explicit racism, marked by events like the Charleston church shooting and the visible and violent presence of white nationalists in places like Charlottesville. Racial justice advocates who predated the shift in the expression of white supremacy have responded in kind, for example, by continuing to build the movement for Black lives, protesting police brutality, and rallying for the removal of Confederate monuments. In some, even a cursory glance at current events reveals that the racial climate in this country has become increasingly hostile and increasingly polarized. There's really no denying it. To confront racism and achieve racial justice, though, we must not only focus on the troubling individual attitudes and stereotypes that manifest in events like Charleston and Charlottesville. We must also recognize and confront the unfortunate reality that racism is built into the basic structures of our society. Structural racism is perhaps best explained through Iris Marion Young's birdcage metaphor. Imagine, if you will, that a bird is trapped in a cage by many wires, where wires represent many forms of disadvantage. If you focus on only one wire or one disadvantage, it's difficult to understand how and why the bird is trapped. Michelle Alexander extends this metaphor by pointing out that the wires need not be specifically designed or developed for the purpose of trapping the bird. Policies can be explicitly race neutral, for example, but have disproportionate racial effects in practice. Yet they nonetheless operate in conjunction with the other wires to keep the bird trapped. Alexander focuses in particular on mass incarceration, using structural racism to explain why people of color are incarcerated at 6 times the rate of white people, when research shows that members of both groups break the law at roughly the same rates. But we can also imagine other examples. Think, for instance, of the Flint water crisis. A young child of color in the United States is disproportionately likely to be affected by infrastructural and environmental issues resulting from inadequate housing that is chosen due to cost, access, and de facto segregation, to name just a few factors. When that young child of color is affected by pollution, proximity to a landfill or hazardous waste site, or in the case of Flint, lead poisoning, he or she is disproportionately likely to receive inadequate medical care, due once again to cost and access. Inadequate medical treatment can lead to a wide range of chronic, lifelong health problems. Thus, these interrelated and interlocking disadvantages can have permanent effects, effects that can keep people of color trapped, effects that can negate access to the so-called American dream. So if we agree that racial justice is an issue, and if we want to reimagine civil society as a site for addressing it, how do we do so? I might suggest that we need to build a collective based in cross-racial solidarity. One way to begin developing this solidarity is to acknowledge the existence of white privilege. This can be a really, really difficult task, because doing so challenges what we take to be central truths about ourselves, our state, and our economy. Let's return briefly to the idea of the American dream, captured in the platitude I mentioned a few minutes ago. Here, you can be anything you want to be if you work hard enough. The word here suggests that this is not the case elsewhere, that the conditions in the United States are uniquely positioned to level the playing field for all. Individually, too, many Americans narrativize their lives as being guided by this directive. That is, when they achieve the goal of becoming what they want to be, they credit their success to their hard work. They made something happen for themselves. They won the competition directed by capitalism. They beat out others to climb up the ladder. But when we factor in the uneven consequences of structural power, we can see that there are far less wires on some bird cages than there are on others. When a bird manages to get free, to squeeze between the bars, hard work may have something to do with it, but the racial privilege of a less restrictive cage, of more routes to freedom, most certainly makes that hard work meaningful and effective. While some white people might individually struggle to narrate an incident in their life history in which they felt as if they had gained an advantage based on the color of their skin, looking at the world structurally allows us to see the nearly invisible operation of white privilege much more clearly. When we zoom out, we can see that white privilege is built into systems of power themselves, which makes it all the more insidious because it is so much more difficult to locate and to explain, and therefore to dismantle. Acknowledging the existence of white privilege can be the first step, but it must not be the endpoint in building collective cross-racial solidarity to combat structural racism. Recognizing that white privilege is real is an explicit rejection of white innocence, the innocence which constitutes the crime of racism, as James Baldwin wrote. But it must not be the endpoint because recognition doesn't fundamentally disable its structural operation. If we are someday able to dismantle structural racism and achieve racial justice through organizing in civil society, It will be because, as Baldwin said, white people got free. Free of the illusion that racial equality already exists, free of the illusion of their own innocence, free of the illusion that racism is not also their problem to solve. Thank you.
Hi, and I will also say that I'm very honored to be here today. Thanks to Sally, Jordan, the Friends of Humanity, Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities for thinking about including me here today. And I'm here to talk to you about feminism and how feminists have re-envisioned or reimagined civil society. And after I read Maria's fine paper that she submitted to us via email a few days ago, I said, wow, that's an awesome argument, an awesome paper in 10 minutes that you covered that, and can I go after her? Because all you need to do is take what she was just saying about white privilege and let's substitute male for that, male privilege, and all of that, everything she just said applies. So I appreciate that she did that for me, and I'm just going to talk then more specifically about the history of feminism, which is what my field is, history of feminism in the West primarily. It's appropriate that I'm discussing feminism just a couple of days after International Women's Day, which was March 8th, a commemoration started by the Socialist Party of America. I told you I was going to forget to turn that on. Socialist Party of America in the early 20th century. It fell out of practice after World War I and was revived in the 1970s by second wave feminists. The United Nations began celebrating it again during the International Women's Year in 1975. That celebration commemorates labor feminism, one of a plethora of varieties of feminism. There's no one way to be feminist, so understand that in the few minutes allotted to me, I have to speak in generalities. Feminism, as it stands today, encompasses nearly all other aspects of social justice, since it is fundamentally anti-hierarchical and anti-oppressive. It's a critique of structures of power and relationships, how power is distributed, who has it, and how they deploy it. Feminism opposes all oppressive systems as disrespectful of others, those who are marginalized and oppressed. Feminists envision a world that eschews militarism, another form of hierarchy and oppression in their view. It eschews militarism, use of force, and exploitation of people, animals, and the environment. The term for that is ecofeminism. Now, to put that in the positive, feminists envision a world of peace, racial, ethnic, and gender harmony and equality, economic security, and civil and political freedom. Edenic though that may sound, but you're never going to achieve a vision if you don't first have the vision, right? Now, I'm a historian, my PhD's in history, so I'm going to go back and do a little bit of backstory here for you as well. Let's see how far I get in my few minutes. Feminists have been identified in ancient Greece, but I'm going to start in the Anglo world of the Western Enlightenment, which we usually define as the modern era. And just mention a few names: Mary Wollstonecraft, Jane Austen, Judith Sargent Murray. All of those are considered founding mothers of at least Anglo-Western feminism. All argued that women had the same ability to reason as men did and deserved the same rights. Wollstonecraft's The Vindication of the Rights of Woman was not widely read at the time due to her reputation, and I'd be happy to take that question when we're done here. But that is now hailed as a feminist classic. All of those women wanted women to be able to realize their full potential, which meant having financial independence and equal rights. They argued for better education and for women to have a public voice. Judith Sargent Murray was one of the founders of Universalism, a liberal religious belief that preached the equality of male and female. And I mention that because religion is intimately and intricately bound up with our understanding about gender roles. Those authors I mentioned greatly influenced Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, who was a public friend, a Quaker. Those two women, Stanton and Mott, were the organizers of the first women's rights convention in the United States in 1848 at Seneca Falls in upstate New York. And if you want to know why then and where then, I can answer that question too in the Q&A. More than 300 women and men from abolitionist, Quaker, and reform circles attended the two-day conference, though only about 100 people signed the Declaration of Sentiments. That Declaration of Sentiments was written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She modeled it on the Declaration of Independence, and it imagined a wholesale reconfiguration of civil society. Frederick Douglass, who attended the conference, called it the grand movement for attaining the civil, social, political, and religious rights of women. And just as an aside, the original document, the original declaration, is lost. The closest thing to it is in the National Archives, and that's a printed copy made by Frederick Douglass in his print shop after the convention. Hashtag find the sentiments if you want to help with that. The Declaration insisted that women, like men, had the right to pursue happiness, and that any law that conflicted with women's happiness was illegitimate and had no validity. That the Creator intended woman to be man's equal, that men be held to the same moral standards as women, that women had as much right to speak in public as men. The signatories called for reform of divorce and property law, and the admission of women to educational institutions and to the professions. The most contentious debate surrounded a resolution in support of women's enfranchisement. Only after an impassioned speech by Frederick Douglass did that pass. Perhaps unsurprisingly, news of the conference and the declaration was not well received. The critics were not very civil about it. The women, the attendees, some of whom were men, were mocked in the press and by the clergy. And that rankled Elizabeth, especially the mocking by the clergy, ranked Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who many years later destroyed her reputation at the time and that of the movement she was associated with when she published The Woman's Bible, wherein she proposed a feminist reinterpretation of Holy Writ. Those women were all white, but there were black feminists too. Sojourner Truth reimagined a world in which black women would be respected alongside white women. Well-educated and well-placed women of color like Mary Church Terrell, founder of the National Association of Colored Women, supported woman suffrage. The NACW's motto was "Lifting as we climb," a philosophy of racial uplift through education and community activism. Women's suffrage, achieved in the United States in 1920, had a much more limited impact than either its supporters or its critics had imagined. The vote changed some things, but not all things, far fewer things actually than they thought. The earth did not spinning on its axis, which was good, and marriage as an institution did not cease to exist, as critics had said would happen when women got the right to vote. But on the other side, there was also still a lot left to do, because suffragists had not imagined what those things were, though. They were not equipped to fight those battles. So the next group that comes along that does that primarily is what we call the second wave. But even before the second wave burst forth, women like Eleanor Roosevelt and others in her circle of social workers and female missionaries those women influenced the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 to include women, and subsequently the Decade of Women, 1975 to 1985, during which the first of 4 global United Nations women's conferences was held. Global feminists envisioned a world in which women would be safe from violence, including FGM, which I'm not going to spell out right here, and intimate partner violence, as well as rape in war, and where women would have the opportunity for a decent education and other means to develop their full potential. Second wave feminists focused on inequality in the law and in professions and educational institutions, including seminaries, as well as cultural and social understandings of gender roles. They reimagined our history, and historians began to incorporate women's history into the discipline for the first time. They also came to support same-sex relationships and, over time, gender nonconformity. Second wave feminists held that restrictive gender roles were bad for men too. They wanted fathers to be co-equal parents and men to be able to express emotions and become nurses and teachers if they wanted to, and not be criticized for taking on what was traditionally regarded as a woman's job, just as feminists wanted it the other way as well, for them to be able to enter into male jobs without being criticized for that. Theologians like Rosemary Radford Ruther examined Jewish and Christian theology and eliminated the sexism inherent in patriarchal traditions within those creeds, and that has increasingly been permeating various Western denominations. So we now consider ourselves to be some time past second wave. Exactly where we are now, there's some debate about that, but probably also past third wave and now into fourth wave. And so what is it that people who consider themselves part of third wave or fourth wave are interested in? What was left undone? Well, of course, we in the last few months have lived through one of those great issues that has been undone, that was left undone by second wave feminists, and that is, the Me Too movement, #MeToo, the whole issue of sexual harassment, and a woman's right to feel safe on the job and in her choice of careers. Sex trafficking is another issue that is in the news and much talked about among those people who consider themselves to be more part of the more modern feminist wave. Sexual health, also part of that. Protecting reproductive rights and reproductive health is part of that too. And then we're still trying to overcome the vestigial images of women that are very common in the media, where women get criticized for things that men would never be criticized for, or at least not in, again, mainstream circles. Things like how they dress and how they wear their hair and what their measurements are and, their makeup and things like that. Just think about the kind of criticism that Hillary Clinton got, for example, during the 2016 campaign that, except for comedians, would never normally be directed at her male opponents. Getting women into STEM fields, things like that. So those are all issues that still remain to be worked on. If you are interested, there's a lot of work to do out there. So I will stop with that. Thank you. Thank you. I couldn't quite read it. I should have.
I'm actually going to stand up. Can everybody hear me? I'm going to.
Here. There you go.
Can people hear me if I talk loud?
The recording will pick you up.
Yeah.
Do you want one of these?
Am I on? Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for having me here. I'm going to pick up at the very end and probably talk a little bit more about contemporary political environment. My belief is that we're here to talk about small-minded political partisanship and how it makes civil public discourse extremely difficult to have as of late. But really, haven't we been living in a world of fake news for a long time, well past this past election cycle? Think of your own life and how your day-to-day living is embedded in various forms of what's now considered fake news. When I think about my own, it's a really difficult situation to even get footing to begin to evaluate it. I mean, there are the big things. History is always written by the victors, so maybe we get half of that. There are the entertaining stories that just can't be edited out, Trojan horse. But there's a lot of contemporary stuff that is so big and so in our faces that it seems to slip right under the radar. In the news lately, the food pyramid and dietary suggestions by the federal government is being rewritten. I've heard it talked about as one of the greatest public health disasters of the 20th century. It, in no small part, is probably responsible for a lot of the obesity and diabetes epidemics. When you go into a supermarket and you see all natural, organic, farm-raised, sure, you have to buy that stuff, but would you put a lot of money on that that's an accurate description of what you're getting? I'm always suspect. Advertising is now synonymous with Photoshop. It's more of a game of Find Waldo to look for the model with the extra 6th toe attached on there. Rice Krispies are good for your child's immune system. Snapchat won't save your pictures. Think back 10 years to the greatest economic crash since the Great Depression. The fake news that got pumped out of the rating agencies are probably the sole culprit that allowed that thing to happen. So top to bottom, it's a hard place to find a view on anything. And for those in academics, the close relationship sometimes between industry and research can be a touchy subject. But maybe you say this isn't what we're here to talk about, that those are all optional items. You can opt out of them if you want. But those are nutrition, economics, privacy, commerce. These are the large fundamental structures that organize our society. And it's hard to find a place where you can be sure that there's some sense of the world as it is and not some fiction laid on top of it. And when our public discourse doesn't begin to try and match up to the world as it is, there's a violence done. And I think all of the speakers before here have spoken to this. There's a violence that's done, and it's extended each time that we take those fictions and add one more layer to it. So how do we tease apart these fictions from the world as it is? Is there even a nonfiction world out there? Is there a way to separate these things? In Yuval Harari's recent book, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, he dives into the thesis that fictions are the single characteristic that have allowed Homo sapiens to dominate the world for 10,000 years. The idea that everything that we do is largely a fiction, and it's our ability to spin those fictions and get a large group of people to agree on them and act accordingly is what has allowed us to dominate the other species. No other species can do that. So what he's talking about is small things to big things, but the really big things are, for example, religion, nations, democracy. All of those things are large groups of people that share a fabricated story about how things should be, and then that allows them to act in unison. Money is a classic example. Everyone has paper in their pockets. Some are worth $1, some are worth 100. There's not that much difference between them. But when you start to have a large group of people who will accept that, from everyone in this country to everyone around the world, suddenly that is a real thing. But the idea of money is a fiction. It's a made-up story that has allowed us to work as a large group and finance the world's modern wonders. So the thing from Harari's point of view is that we are the dominant apex predator, and lying is our superpower. Lying is the single thing that has allowed us to do this. So is fake news really anything new? I mean, this seems to be one of the dominant characteristics of our species and has allowed us to ride high as we have. So how do we tease this idea of fiction apart from the world as it is? And this is my point, is that when we choose not to see the world as it is, we see it in stereotypes, shorthands, rules of thumb, and this drives the incivility. This drives the inability to kind of be present with another individual or any number of individuals. All right, I'm going to show some examples from, I'm not sure if I can work all these things. So these are second-year undergraduate students, and it's a small drawing exercise. They're paired up, and they have to draw each other in motion. And the drawing can only last as long as the motion lasts. And I'm going to show you these in a sequence of 3 and how they evolve between those. And the first ones are these stereotypes, these shorthands that the students have in their head. They're not looking at all. And the important thing to realize here is that in the School of Architecture, when we teach drawing, we don't actually teach drawing. Drawing's not that hard, right? I mean, you can put a whole range of marks on a piece of paper. Anybody in this room can. The thing that's difficult about it is knowing where and when and how to put those marks. And that's, in our perspective, much more of an activity of seeing, of learning how to observe the world in front of you as it is so that you can record it. And so that's how this is going to tie back in there. So this, you can see that it's basically a stick figure. It's not even a representation of a person in front of them. And there's no motion there, right? There's a stereotype in someone's head, and they're just trying to figure out how to begin to draw. And these are all beginning drawers. And this is all from the same sets of exercise, which I taught with Greg Watson, and these are actually his images. So this is all part of this first series, and you can see they're trying to figure it out. They go from a stick figure to a stick figure that's kind of got a more dynamic pose. And then the one on the far right, you start to see these slashes, but the figure is still standing still, right? So they're trying to figure out some symbolic language, some stereotype about what motion looks like or what they think motion looks like. And then as they get more and more into it, you see these things, right? And so now you see 4 bodies, 6 arms. It's as if it's a film reel stopped, right? It's their idea of how motion looks. So they're still not even looking at what's in front of them. They're coming up with ideas in their head about how to represent motion. And then as they sit with it longer, it actually they start to look at what's in front of them, and the thing starts to have the character of motion in it. And then when they sit with it long enough, they stop thinking that there's a person that they're drawing and that person is doing motion, and they just start to look at the motion. And this might be hard for those of you who've never done something like this to look at before, but you know, as you look around, the kind of density where people are spinning and rotating, and then the kind of open space. Imagine a dancer moving across a field. They're standing in one spot spinning. There's some dynamic motion of contraction, and then there's this kind of expansion out there. So all of a sudden, the stereotypes are no longer there. The person's looking at what's in front of them, looking at the world as it is, and they're not filling up the space with ideas that they have in their head. So I'm going to show you another quick sequence of landscape drawings that do the same kind of thing. So this is a student just out there. They're all symbolic. They're just looking at the landscape, and they have stand-ins for trees. Those probably aren't what the trees look like, but then they spend the whole semester, and this is from the same class, and they spend the whole semester going out there. Every day we have class, which is 3 times a week, and spending a half hour working on it. And we call these things living drawings. And so if it's fall and the leaves fall, they have to erase the leaves on the tree and draw it in the ground. And if someone swept them up the next day, they have to erase those on the ground. It's an exercise purely in observation. There's no final goal that we're after in terms of what it is. But what starts to happen is they stop looking at what is supposed to happen in front of them, and they're engaged, they're curious. There's a kind of connection to what they're doing in a present way that allows it to happen. And then they do a project, and this next one is going to be like the last one you saw in the last exercise. So now we ask them to kind of suddenly change, and even with this one, they're drawing all the objects, which is what we're used to seeing, right? The trees, the grass, the river. And then all of a sudden, we just ask them to draw the space in between there. And so they start to see something differently, and that subverts, that undermines all the kind of stereotypes, all the assumptions they have in their head. And they start to be present with what's in front of them. They start to see the world as it is, and it's not full of any of the symbolic language that you're used to. I am short on time. All right. So 2 quick stories here. So this is a quote from, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but Google's DeepMind project developed an algorithm to play Go, which is an ancient Chinese game. Extremely simple, extremely beautiful, extremely complex. 19 by 19 grid, black and white pieces, and you try and capture each other. And it's 2,000 plus year history. And the Google program beat the grandmaster in the world 3 times in a row, lost once, and then won it again. So 4 out of 5 times. They then had a program that they allowed to self-learn. They didn't even watch a human being play, and it taught itself. And within a short period of time, it beat the previous version 100 games in a row without losing. So the important thing to realize about Go is it's a game of stories. That when you play Go, it's so complex. The number of configurations on the board are, they say, greater than the atoms in the universe. It's a 19 by 19 grid, so you can imagine. And so it's more complex than you can get a picture of the whole thing. So it's orders of magnitude above chess. And you play by stories. As configurations happen, that relates to a story, and then you can play that out. You know, there's the crow's foot formation, and that allows you to do this move and this move. So what this is saying is the other masters of Go, as they were watching it, they were completely dumbfounded. They couldn't even explain what they were seeing, and they couldn't put a story to it. This thing was beating them over and over in a game that it has a cult following of masters of this thing, and they couldn't put a story to it. They couldn't make sense of it. So these ideas that drive AlphaGo will drive our future. There's an abstraction over a narrative, and that's increasingly becoming present inside our society, and I think it explains a lot of what we've been seeing in public discourse as of recently. Dialogue is essential in our society, and we build trust through stories. They bind us together, but our narratives are adjusting to a new, more abstract set of fictions. AlphaGo saw something that was there that we didn't, because it didn't map onto our stories as we think of them now. And so from watching our students, to get an understanding of how to begin to perceive that abstraction that AlphaGo could see and the other masters, the human masters, couldn't see, deep learning comes from engagement, curiosity, and patience, and not making assumptions about what you see. So I'll end there.
Wow, thank you to all four of our speakers. So let's begin a conversation. Who would like to begin? I think Sally's getting microphones. Did something about what one of the speakers said come up for you? Oh, thank you.
Someone's got to start.
Yes, they do.
Yes, you do.
I appreciate it.
What are we really trying to accomplish here? Are we talking about the lack of civil discourse and what's caused it, or is there another object of this conversation? I mean, Sally, I'll ask you that question.
Me?
Yeah.
I think that initially, we need to look back. I know that this is something that it's an inaugural conversation. And so I think that the idea is to look back and say, where have we come from, so that we can better understand where we're going as far as civil discourse is. And
It seems to. Well, yeah, I'm formulating. I've got the microphone. I know No, it seems to me, and Carl, going back to the Greeks, their conversations, their discourse was more face to face. They came together in an alley, and they spoke about what they thought. And it's much more difficult. It's much easier, I think, to have civil discourse when you're face to face. And I think one of the problems that we have today is the anonymity of discourse, where we're having this and we're hiding behind Facebook, and we're hiding behind email, and we're hiding behind text messages. And so it's very, very easy to take a position that upsets people because they don't know who you are.
Mhm.
And we started the conversation of, and Corey, I think you were talking about it, the small-minded politicians. I used to be a broad-minded politician. And the problem that we have now in debate is that we represent people like us. The ladies talked about that as well. When you have a representative or you have a congressman, they tend to represent people just like them, and they don't have to care about people that are not like them. And it's in a way causing this discivil discourse that we see today. And I don't know what the answer is. This is just an impression on my part. I don't know how we can change that. And I think that if we continue the anonymity of the internet, it will continue to get worse and worse.
Well, thank you so much for being willing to be the first person to react. So how would you guys suggest, what Dr. Richard was saying about the smaller populace
respond, and
approach,
then we'll-
how do you extrapolate it to a larger population?
I don't know. I think it was a very good point, because I think studies have shown that people actually, even people that are very, very ideological, speak to each other when they're face to face in a much more civil fashion than they do when they're anonymous on social media. And that's been proven by studies, not just by anecdotal evidence. How do we go back to a more participatory society? I don't have the answer to that.
I think discipline. Discipline is no longer existing, it seems like nowadays, and it has a lot to do with the government, the schools, the people at home. I grew up in a military background, and I'm thankful for it because I was disciplined, and that's how I am now today, disciplined. That's the problem. They don't have discipline anymore. You try to spank your child, you're going to jail. That's wrong.
Dr. Sager?
Yeah, this might be an unpopular answer, but I think there are some real limits to empathy as a method of changing society. I think political action is required in addition to empathy, and that sometimes can feel uncivil. But like, you know, I teach the 19th century. Slavery was not abolished without a war. So there were real limits to the ability to get white slaveholders to empathize with the subject position of the enslaved. I think empathy is one route, and it's a route we have to continue to try, but it has to be paired with other strategies as well in civil society, I think.
I wanted to sort of broaden that question a little bit. So transformative dialogue does have those two approaches. You know, what changes minds or hearts, you know, so you do tell that personal story. And I was wondering what each of you guys thought about, is that the approach, or is moving the cones and then making sure people will inadvertently, because through political action, they have no choice but to make those changes, or what is the intersection of those two things, empathy and political action?
Oh, I'm not sure that I have the answer, but I'm going to throw a few things out there, and I agree with what she said, absolutely, and what he was saying, Carl was saying as well, because there's studies that show that people who have a relationship to others, people who are othered, actually are much more empathetic. So for example, and of course this is not universally true, it's a generalization, but so for example, people who know Mexican immigrants personally or live in the neighborhoods or work with them or whatever are much less likely to say the kinds of things that Donald Trump has said about Mexican immigrants, just to use one example. Also, that was also true for when gay people were trying to gain acceptance, that once their family members began to know that their loved one was gay, that they were much more open and accepting of the whole idea of being gay. So I guess I'm not really adding a whole lot to what they've said, but certainly being willing to speak up and speak out, which actually, as you mentioned, that can be considered disrespectful. But for people who come from our kinds of backgrounds, we don't mind that, because we want to speak truth to power, and to explain, to do that, to force them to move the cones, you must be willing to step outside a traditionally prescribed boundary.
Okay.
We've got a couple of questions up here.
Okay, great.
I just wanted to make a comment about the word dialogue. I have an expectation when I enter in a dialogue that I'm going to be heard, and I'm going to listen to the other person's point of view, and then maybe some change takes place. And the last couple of years, I've participated in commenting on the internet, on sites, and I've never had anybody else come back and say, you know, you make a good point of view. It was always like just arguing back and forth, and that sense that, we go back to the Greek ideal of dialogue, was someone makes a statement, someone else might make the opposite statement, and then between the two, there's a synthesis that becomes not only something new, but something better. And I think that's what's missing in a lot of the political discussion, because it's our side versus your side, or it's winner versus loser. And if ever there's something in the middle, that's called compromise, which is a dirty word. But no one uses the word synthesis in the way that the Greek sense of the two opposites come together and make something better, or progressive. Can we use the word progressive here? Thank you.
Professor
Yeah,
Seft.
it's a great point.
Yeah.
My general belief, though, is that while empathy and civil discourse is good and important, everything that we're talking about, that the power structures that are making those decisions, we don't see. They're not in front of us. I mean, so whether it's finance and politics or any other manner of thing, I mean, maybe I'm cynical about this, but it seems to be happening at a scale and a way of systems and structure that individual dialogue, while good for building community, hasn't proven to be good for making the changes we want to see. And that makes, I mean, I'm not sure if I made it, but the point I was trying to make is that there is a new way of systems thinking that has outscaled the stories we've had up to now, and we've got to figure out some other way to think about this stuff.
I think just to comment briefly, I think the point that Corey's presentation drew out really nicely is that we can't even agree on a set of facts. We're debating about facts, and so we can't have a discussion about interpreting those facts and what those facts mean, because we can't even agree that climate change is real, right? So we can't talk about what is a solution to climate change if we can't agree that the issue in fact exists. And I don't know that that's a new phenomenon, and I think Corey's presentation drew that out well, but we are not doing well at responding to that, to the sliding terrain of what even are the issues.
My frustration is that I think we have lost a sense of civility or civil society, and that we're now in an era of a zero-sum game. As you mentioned, compromise is a dirty word. And so, I'm concerned that in our current political environment, friends and family are now having political arguments more so than ever before, at least in that I can remember. And so I'm concerned that we don't have a sense that there is a common good or that there is a need to work together. And I think that the idea that somehow it's better if you're in small groups face to face, I don't think holds water. I spend a lot of time at the Louisiana legislature, and I'm just grateful they're not hitting each other. And so, how do we move into or move back to or move forward to some sense that even our elected officials have an obligation to be serious about solving problems? Because I think now we've devolved into, everybody's wearing their jersey all the time, whether you're in the grocery store or the church pew or wherever soccer field, that, you're either with him or you're against him, and there's not a level of trust and communication and respect. And so how do we foster some of those values in our community when we have very different ideological perspectives?
Anybody interested in tackling that one?
I guess I would pivot back to sort of my answer that when we zoom out and make it less about individuals and more structural, we can sometimes remove some of the emotion behind the debate that gets people uncivil. But I guess I would also say that incivility is sometimes necessary when someone is denying your fundamental humanity. And so we're going to be uncomfortable sometimes when we're talking about issues that are important. And it's maybe learning how to make that uncomfortableness productive that we need to be working harder on.
Dr. Alured.
Thank you. I just have a one-word response to you, Melissa: redistricting. Because I believe that what has happened, in the last 2 or 3 decades, we could is we've gone to basically single party districts, and it's gotten worse and not better. So Republicans, just to throw both sides, like Republicans don't have to take into account that they have Democratic voters within their district that they're going to need to reach out to and try to hold the center in order to get reelected, and the same thing on the other side, and that we have chiseled our way into these completely warring paths, and until we go back to just kind of more general non-ideologically driven or non-racially driven districts, I don't think we're going to get the kind of politics back that characterized us before, I don't know, 1990. Thank you.
That was super well said, and that was sort of what my take was going to be. I also wanted to ask about Wollstonecraft's reputation, but just to scab onto your statement real quick, I do think that it is this fundamental seeming divide that everyone feels on one side or another, and perfectly serves the structural problems continuation rather than discussion of reform dismantlement. And that all really comes back to us choosing to put ourselves on a side when, as we know when we step back, there is no side. There's a big blue dot. So.
Brady, there's a gentleman in the blue shirt.
Did you want me to answer the Wollstonecraft?
Please.
Okay, just really briefly. Well, she, she believed that that women did not have to get married to have sex or to have babies. Well, right there in the 1790s, boom, you're gone, right? Okay, and so she was basically one of the early free love advocates. She lived the way that she philosophized. Marriage was a trap for women. Women lost significant rights when they got married, so why bother to get married? So she had some children out of wedlock, and the sad thing is, because of that, she was completely discredited. It discredited her writing. It was resurrected many decades later. And as I mentioned, a few early 19th century feminists read it. But really, Wollstonecraft, I would think this is fair to say, was not really read, not as part of the canon anyway, until probably the 1970s or 1980s.
And is still underrepresented.
And is still underrepresented, yes. So.
Yes, sir.
I want to go back to Corey Saff's point about the violence that results from not seeing reality as it is and what our illusions do. There was recently a great article in The Atlantic about the impact of the Tet Offensive in 1968. And it said basically, it traced our argument over what are facts to that event. That basically we were lied to as a country by the President and the Secretary of Defense, kept secrets from the Congress, and that the corrosive effect of that continues to reverberate through. I mean, the people still argue whether we went to the moon or not. But there are the possibility of events like the Tet Offensive, like Katrina. These things only happen in third world countries. Katrina, Rita, Gustav Ike, these things, that you can suppress reality for a time, but you can't do it a long time, that eventually it catches up with you. And I think that where we are right now is that reality is catching up with us. We haven't been able to come to terms with it yet, but there is a reality there, and it's closing in, and we're trying not to deal with it.
Yes, please.
Just as a response, I mean, I tend to buy almost all of what Hariri says. I mean, the idea that the way there's not a place you can look at that is not some kind of fiction. And there are some fictions that we like and are beneficial. And they go by. And so I agree with what you say, but I'm not sure it's catching up with us. I think things are changing, and so the fictions that we've had up to this point are breaking down. And there's now a scramble for new kinds of fictions, and it's in a very unegalitarian structure that those new fictions are being created.
Okay.
Thank you. I have a lot of different things swirling around in my mind right now. This is a very important conversation, and when I saw the topic of the conversation, I thought it was just so timely and pertinent, and really couldn't come at a better time, because we're all facing that situation that's been described where one person is on one side and one is on the other. When Don Bakke was talking a little bit ago about the internet and the impersonal nature of communication, I just had a thought about road rage and how brave people are sitting inside their own car when nobody can hear what they're saying. And I've yelled at people and, said all sorts of crazy things, but I know they don't know,
Right.
And so I'm very brave when it comes to that. But the thing about dialogue, I read recently about, because it comes up so often, especially today, the advice was listen to the other person, listen to what they have to say, see if you can pick up on a shred of common ground that you can build upon to then create the dialogue. But the problem comes with something that Corey just pointed out, and I just think this whole thing is fascinating. That's very difficult when people are coming at a situation with preconceived notions. They've seen things differently, literally not seeing. It's like one of the drawing exercises that you have in art class where they say, turn the picture upside down and draw it. You actually depict it more realistically when you're drawing it upside down.
Right.
And so and then I also wanted to agree with the gentleman over here about character, discipline, and the virtues that are just seem to be out the windoo these days. And that's just a general comment.
And that actually piggybacks a follow-up for me. So as educators, Kenneth Gergen says that civil discourse, a certain amount of modesty has to come with civil discourse. You have to allow a little room that maybe you're not wrong, but there's room in your reality for someone else's. And I was wondering, as educators, how do you teach such a thing in an when does that have to begin? Is it too late by the time that students get to you all at the collegiate level? And what are your thoughts about that? How do you engender it in your own classrooms?
I don't know if it's too late, but obviously it's like any other trait. The later you start in instilling that, the more difficult it is. So I'm listening to a lot of this. I keep thinking about education, and maybe elementary education. Maybe that's the place to begin to solve a lot of these problems. I mean, that's not a very quick solution, but it's a good one, I think.
Right.
I have at least one of my students in the audience, so I'm hesitant to give away my tricks. But I think the Socratic method is really useful for helping students work out their own ideologies and assumptions, and the set of ideologies and assumptions that they bring to the classroom. So rather than saying you're wrong, right, ask a set of questions that lead a student back to where that belief or notion comes from. And they oftentimes are able to work out themselves and then articulate the process of having worked out themselves where that notion comes from, and maybe that they haven't fully investigated it yet, right? It's just being open to ask the question that I'm asking my students to do in the classroom. You don't have to arrive at an answer, but just be open to ask a question.
I'd reiterate that in the studio environment, the Socratic method is largely how we do things. But in answer to your question, I mean, what I keep saying to my students all the time is that there is no right answer. There are lots of wrong answers, but there's not a right answer. And that's the premise for what happens in studio.
No, I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I confess I came here thinking I knew what it was all about, and I tend to agree with a lot of what's been said. But when Corey finished speaking, my mind got blown.
Perfect.
And I looked at the spectrum that we have out there, from Carl with the ancient Greeks and Romans and a nice, theoretically civil discourse, to Maria and Janet, kind of where we are now. And I may have misunderstood you completely, but Corey, what I got from you is we don't know where we are, and we don't know where we're going, which is why we have to reimagine. And maybe we're in the dark wood and to mix it with others where the center doesn't hold. And we need to move through that. I don't know, I know that's not cheery, and it's not easy, but looking at the four of you on the panel there, that's the spectrum that I see.
Just a quick response. I mean, I agree that we are moving through something, and it's not by choice. And either we can figure out what it is we're moving through, because I think the kind of local politics, while important locally, are not addressing what's happening around us, the forces that are at play.
With the tremendous wisdom that's coming out of here, and obviously some intelligent people with lots of different opinions, some things that each of us think that, oh, everybody agrees with me, we find out later in having conversation that maybe we're the minority, maybe we're the only one that believes that or whatever. So if we want to be a Pollyanna and say, well, it can be solved, we can get back to more of a civil discourse. Maybe the basics of it are, if you're trying to solve a problem, you first have to decide what's the problem definition. And so far, it seems that we get stuck there. Society right now can't agree with what the problem is. Okay? And so if there's some way now with the phenomenal things that education and certainly technology can do, certainly we have the capacity to do it. It's a matter of having the discipline to figure out, okay, how do we first decide what is the problem? And admit that we're not going to all agree, but we say, okay, of the definitions of this particular problem, whichever one it is, because there's a gajillion of them, you know, X% think this, X% think that. Do we believe more in this academician or politician as to that is the one that we're going to try to solve? And then you come up with a separate set of elements as to how we're going to solve that. And then you go to the third one is, did it really solve it? And then you go back and forth and into it. But unless we have some sort of a technique, we sit here and say, oh, I disagree with that person, and they won't change their mind, I'm not going to change my mind. So we're just focusing on what we disagree about as opposed to something that we could come together as, oh yeah, okay, I don't fully agree with that, your definition of the problem, but I can support it. You know, that's better than not doing anything.
Do you all have any responses to that? About perhaps having a set of guidelines when conversations happen. I don't know if that was in preparation, and forgive me for summarizing. So it was a political concept, civility was a political concept, and now it's become sort of a personal one. You're either polite or you're not polite. And so is there a way to restructure it so it becomes, conversations become more theoretical, or not theoretical, more impersonal, and it's not about whether or not you're a snowflake or you're too sensitive or you're trying to be PC, and it's really just a set of guidelines so that progress can happen. Yes.
I mean, so the idea of the individual to the larger scale network, in architecture there's an idea of critical regionalism which tries to address the idea that we're part of supply chains that are global in impact, but when we make a piece of architecture, you want to make it locally and specific to that place. You want to make it have the character of that place. Like what is South Louisiana like? But at the same time, you're going to buy plywood made in Canada, and your electrical wire was made in Poland, and everything else. And so the idea that there are those two things at play, and if they're in a struggle with each other, there's no solving it. We have to find a way, I think, that they can both coexist, that the kind of regional quality of, then the local quality of discussion can coexist with the artificial intelligence and the kind of networked world that is giving us all the advantages of technology and everything else, as an example.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
You can hear me okay? Mm-hmm. I want to thank everybody. This is a fantastic event. This is a fantastic panel. I want to suggest that there's another fiction here, and that's the fiction sometimes that historically disciplined civil discourse actually creates change for the better, right? And I think this is a point that some of you have making, but Professor Richard, for instance, is talking about a small group of people who own lots of other people, right? So civil discourse in Athens is not the people, it's some of the people, right? And as Professor Seeger suggested, it took a war to free the enslaved in the United States. For African Americans to vote in the South, it took civil rights. None of that was disciplined civil discourse. So I think it's something that we should be thinking about as well. I mean, ultimately, this is a structural problem about our political system, as Professor Allred said. The minority party is ruling our country.
I think we have time for one more.
Okay, with this gentleman over here.
Sorry if I stumble over my words. I kind of have stage fright. I think, from what I'm hearing, a lot of us are kind of falling for Dr. Seeger, which talked about the trap of individual dialogue, right? I'm kind of wondering, we've all said, we have Facebook arguments, road rage, where we're arguing and literally nothing is getting done. And I was kind of wondering, the world's going on whether we're agreeing or not. The world around us is still moving whether we're agreeing or even disagreeing. So I'm kind of asking, the whole conversation is around civil society, but civil society is moving with or without our dialogue. So are we even asking the right question, trying to figure out how we should be in dialogue if civil society is still going without us?
I'm so proud. That's my student. He's asking, are we asking the right question, right? And I think he's right? If you go back to theorists that have sort of pushed against the Enlightenment in a lot of ways, they're asking, can civil society be a site for problem solving? And I think that's a real question. Is there a site that exists independent of state or commercial influence? And I don't know that site exists anymore. I hope that it does, but I think to make it a productive space, we do have to think about the structures rather than ourselves.
Okay, I lied. There's time for another.
We are going to go a couple of minutes.
Okay.
I have a feeling that we're not including a temporal element to our discussions. Time, and not just time over a long time, but time in the moment. When the Romans would meet for the Senate, they would travel great distances and have great debates. When the praetors, or the magistrates in the Senate, would make rulings, they heard both sides. And they considered both sides because they had to consider both sides, right? In today's society, with social media, it's an instant society. Your answer is now, and it shouldn't be now. But it's now for a couple of reasons. I think it's now because it's okay to be wrong, because you've got all your buddies who are just as wrong, right? Or it's okay to be right because your buddies are just as right because you have your group. You're not outside of your element. You're not learning. You're not expressing. You're not engaging to learn the other side. The temporal element through the Socratic method is absolutely the best way to educate a kid. The best way. I learned that because I got my butt kicked in law school. And the best day of my life was the worst day of my life. I had an argument in front of the Supreme Court of Louisiana. And I had to argue against 4 judges who disagree with me. There's 7, right? How many do I need to win? I need 4. We won. But I spent 6 months preparing for one oral argument for 15 minutes. And not to talk to the guys who liked me, but to talk to the guys who didn't. And in today's society of instant gratification and participation trophies, where you win for showing up, or you win for having an opinion, that's just not enough.
Thank you. How many more do you want to do?
think he said what I was thinking, that structures are inherently self-preserving. Hierarchies pronounce themselves maintaining organizations. But on those wonderful occasions, like we saw in Tallahassee, Florida, when it becomes uncomfortable to be in the hierarchy because young people are gathering with a loud and persistent voice that says, we need some change in our gun control laws, and they put enough pressure on a Republican governor, a hard right Republican governor, Rick Scott, that he actually signs a bill that is immediately challenged by the NRA, but it indicates that some civil discourse has taken place, some change has been made in a state that was known as the gunshine state, for goodness sakes, and that there is a chance for moving ahead into a new future, despite the forces against civil discourse. That's all.
Yeah, but I think importantly, the actions that led to this potential change were not sanctioned, right? They were acts of protest. They were acts that made a lot of people very uncomfortable. Yeah, absolutely.
We are going to take a couple more questions. I had one. This is particularly to Dr. Alured and Dr. Sager. So what do you think the role of the other is in civil discourse in both of the fields of feminism and in structural racism? Are you there as are men and people not of color there as participants? Are they there as merely listeners? What is the role, in your opinion?
Okay. Well, certainly men are, we have male allies that, we can't do it without them, really. We have to have them, and we love them and support them. I think I'm speaking for the larger feminist community. Melissa probably answered this just as well as I can. But I would just agree with what everyone has said already, that you have to be willing to be politically engaged. You have to be willing to put yourself on the line, your body on the line, your career on the line sometimes, to speak truth to power and to push against those structures that are seeking to push you back to a way that we are not willing to do that anymore. Or not, push us back to a time that we thought had passed and we don't want to come again. Let me put it that way.
Okay.
So did I answer your question? Or
I think
were you
so,
asking
yeah.
me? Okay.
I think allyship, there are different schools of thought on this, but one thing that we struggle with in allyship, especially as a white ally to communities of color, is that it can't fundamentally be about you, once again, right? About making yourself feel better for the structural privilege that you carry on the basis of race. If your allyship stops there, then it's not really allyship. Allyship is fundamentally about listening to communities of color and about using your privilege in ways that advance that cause, right, structurally.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to make some comments, more coming from my generation. I feel, and there's been a few statements, generalized statements about my generation. We're entitled, instant gratification, there's no discipline, we use social media too much. And that can be true. But I also believe social media can be a great tool, such as with the Me Too movement. It's a great tool for women, for minorities, just for people who have been marginalized to come. And I also feel it's not necessarily instant gratification. There can be great discourse there. I think it just depends on who you're talking to. If you're friends with closed-minded people and that's who you're talking to, you're gonna get closed-minded answers. And I feel like these blanket statements over our generations keep us from having healthy discourse, especially with older generations. Because I understand we live in a very innovative, very fast-moving, that's how we grew up, and so that's how we live our lives. We're very out there with our opinions and our statements. We're not afraid to say something that will offend someone because we're tired of seeing the things that we see. And we're not afraid to speak out from that. And I think there's just misunderstanding between the generations. So I guess my question is, how can we kind of bridge that gap so that adults from all generations who are concerned about the same problems can still have healthy discourse and healthy conversations, so that it's not just one group of people focusing on an issue, but much more.
Can I say one thing? Just first of all, I think that I would argue that the comments are not generational specific. I think we've all adapted to this sort of instant using social media. I mean, my mom and her 70-something-year-old high school friends are also, combative on Facebook, not having real dialogue. So I'm not sure in the context of today it was necessarily I think we've all sort of reformed ourselves to this sort of, it's easy to say things that you're not looking at the person. But I understand what you're saying. I just wanted to clarify that for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I actually strongly agree with what you just said. I mean, I have two daughters who are kind of coming of age, or 11 and 13, and their life online, and they're not obsessive about it, but there's something I think that is just amazing that's happening. Like, there's a transparency, and there's not a connection like interpersonal, but the kinds of things that our society would repress, like for every generation before us, is now easily talked about. It's in the public discourse, and there's no way around that. And that has, in my mind, fundamentally changed. Like, I can't imagine in a positive way that I could do what my children do, because they're engaged in these conversations. So I agree completely that the kind of negative descriptions, those things are all true, but I think that's, there was a report just out today, I think that the fake news on Twitter travels some like order of magnitude quicker than real news. And so the idea the negative things kind of stay in our presence, that we can't forget those, but there's a large scale, broad change about the way social and all kinds of issues are happening. And I think it's actually magic.
Yeah.
I think you make a really important point, and I do sense that tone as well, here and elsewhere. I think one way, and I'm coming back to the same point over and over again, like, forgive me, is to pivot from the individual to the structural, right? The generations above you want to blame your generation by making it about your individual responsibility, right? You're lazy, you care too much about avocados, you care too much about offending people, get a job, right? But you're graduating into an economy that sucks, right? And that's the structural reality that we're not realizing. You're graduating into an economy where you need a college degree to have a shot at getting a decent job.
And yet the Dow is higher.
Right, and the Dow is higher than ever. And even then, it's just a shot, right? And so I think if you can pivot to the structural when you're trying to have a discussion, then you can deflect attention about your individual actions, which are not really relevant, and talk more about the world that has been handed to you, which is not really in great shape, as we've all agreed here.
Well, sort of related to that, I'm wondering about, with especially technology changing as much as it has, what impact does that type of technology have upon the structural system that we have? Do we even need a legislature anymore if we all had clickers, okay, and just instant vote there? So, if you could talk about that.
Well, that reminds me of Ross Perot, actually. In 1992, he suggested doing away with the U.S. Congress, and what we would do is we would all sit in our living rooms with our remote controls, and there would be a bill, and there would be, I guess, a 30-second commercial for the bill, a 30-second commercial against the bill, and then we would vote. And I could not imagine a worse system.
Well, I'd like to thank today's presenters, Carl Richard, Maria Sager, Janet Alured, and Corey Saft, for their engaging thoughts and ideas. But I'd like to particularly thank you all for actively participating in this inaugural event. Without you, there would be no journey, and I'm heartened by not only the presenters, but those of you in the audience. And I was once told that if you leave an event like this and you feel good and satisfied, that it hasn't worked. And so I encourage you all, to come to the reception and continue the conversation with each other and with the presenters who will be on hand. A reminder to please fill out your evaluation forms and leave them at the registration table. We really need that feedback. Now I welcome Mag Ritchie, President of the Friends of Humanities, to share a few words.
Thank you, Elsa. And a great job, Elsa. I just want to thank all of you for being here. This was an inaugural event. It was a creation. And like I'm almost in tears, I am blown away by the incredible panel and the participation of people who care so much. So thank you. Please fill out your surveys because it gives us your reaction and it tells us what to do. We want this to be an annual event. I'm sorry, I'm blown away. I really am. And so on behalf of both the university and the Friends of the Humanities, thank you for being here. I will put out at the registration table membership forms because we would like to have you all as members of Friends of the Humanities to continue the great work that we do both in supporting the humanities classrooms and in partnering with LEH to bring public humanities programs. Thank you so much.